Good evening, everyone. I'm Richard Ice, Provost for the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. It is my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for the 2026 Ralph Gross Global Lecture. The Ralph Gross Lectures focus on global topics and a broad range of interdisciplinary liberal arts issues. The lecture series was established at the request of the Gross family in honor of Ralph Gross, whose generosity and legacy still resonate here at St. John's University. A St. Cloud native and a 1965 St. John's economics graduate. Cheer that. Oh, Lewis is back there clapping. The economics. He's the Clemens Chair in economics there. Ralph pursued advanced studies in business and accounting at the University of Minnesota. He began his professional career as a CPA at Arthur Andersen Accounting, and then went on to become controller, part owner, and finally president and CEO of SPS companies in the Twin Cities. Ralph's deep, abiding affection for St. John's was evident in his generosity toward his alma mater, including a substantial gift upon his passing in 2010 that helped establish the Ralph Gross Chair in Business and the Liberal Arts, the Ralph Gross First Generation Scholarship Fund, and the Ralph Gross Global Lecture. His humble, ethical, and trustworthy nature remains an inspiration to his family, friends, and employees. Our heartiest thanks to Ralph's family, many of whom are with us here this evening. Thank you for being here for this event that honors your brother's lasting legacy. To begin tonight's lecture, I invite Joy Rice, the director of the Center for Global Education, to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thanks, Richard. So, on behalf of the Center for Global Education and the Experience Hub, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Martha Johnson. Dr. Johnson lectured is entitled Challenging the Mythology of Why, Where, and How in Study Abroad. In our time together, she will examine common assumptions of who study abroad is for and highlight how students from every major, background, and identity can and sometimes cannot benefit from global learning experiences. It is a particular honor to welcome Dr. Johnson to CSB and SJU. She is an innovative leader and mentor to many of us in the field of global education and has been guiding voice for over 35 years with roots that stretch back to Minnesota. Many of us come to know her with her leadership at the Learning Abroad Center at the University of Minnesota. Whenever we look to benchmark best practices in the field, we rarely had to look farther than Dr. Johnson and her team there. Dr. Johnson earned her Bachelor of Arts from the St. Mary's University, her Master's of Arts from the University of St. Thomas, also my master's, good job. Her PhD in American Studies from the University of East Anglia in England. She is currently the Provost and Chief Academic Officer for CA Kappa Education Abroad, an organization that runs high-impact study abroad programs around the world and currently partners with CSB and SJU on our semester programs in both Italy and Spain. Dr. Johnson has taught short-term programs in Ireland, Australia, presents frequently in national and international conferences, serves on boards for organizations such as NAFSA, the Forum on Education Abroad, DA Global, the Global Leadership League, and the Fund for Education Abroad. She has authored numerous articles and books, chapters on global education. This evening, she will draw on her experience to help us explore how global learning can strengthen skills, broaden perspectives, and expand what is possible for our shared future. With that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Martha Johnson.
It's always interesting if you're as old as I am to hear people introduce you, because then you just think, oh my goodness, I'm going to be a great disappointment. But I will open with saying how thrilled I am to be here this evening and to talk with you all on topics that I'm very passionate about. So thank you so much for the invitation. I will add that this is a wonderful homecoming for me. I attended the St. John's Leadership Summer Camp 3 times in 7th, 8th, in between going into high school. And I love looking at the art on the back walls, because you might not know this, but I got the calligraphy certificate 3 years running. And to this day, I'm famous for my place cards. So thank you very much, St. John's, for that. As was discussed, I spent 19 years in Catholic education. I went to Nativity Grade School in St. Paul. I went to Durham Hall High School in St. Paul. I was in the last graduating class before it became Cretin-Durham Hall, which some of you might know it as. And then I went on to St. Mary's, where I double majored in English and theater. During my time at St. Mary's, I studied abroad at Trinity College in Dublin. Interestingly, as was often the case back in the day, that was not something supported by my institution. In fact, the head of the chair of the English department said I couldn't get credit for my classes at Trinity College in Dublin, which, if any of you know it, it's a pretty good school. But I was that student who then went to the provost and said, "Are you sure?" And the provost said, "Are you kidding? Where do I sign?" But I, early in my life, had barriers to going abroad. I cried the whole way to Ireland. I'm sure I wouldn't make friends. I got on a bus and was in a dorm with one payphone at the entire university. I was the only person from St. Mary's there, and within 24 hours, I met people who were amazing, and of course, had a really amazing academic experience. I was a mad Samuel Beckett and Joyce fan as an undergrad, so it was exactly the right place for me to be. I went on to, as was discussed, do my master's at St. Thomas, again in literature, and then to do a PhD that was able to combine theater and literature. And so I've been very fortunate to have this amazing career and work that has allowed me to continue to tie together academics and my professional life, which is one of the things that is interesting about this field, is that because when I entered it, it wasn't a field. There wasn't necessarily a pathway for how to do it. It was very, very organic. And so that's one of the things that I will be talking a little bit about this evening. So, as was discussed, I've worked in education abroad since 1991. My first job out of college, because I didn't know what my career path would be, didn't really have a plan. I went to Kinko's and made one cover letter and one resume, true story, and sent it in for a job I heard about to be a representative for a study abroad program in London for a place called Regent's College. And I was fortunate enough to get the job, and it meant that I could travel around the U.S. and go to colleges and get to go to London on someone else's dime a couple times a year, which was really, from me, the draw. What I didn't know at the time, because it wasn't even a career path, it wasn't a profession, and I think that's an interesting thing. It wasn't an intentional plan to do something. It was one job that sounded cool, and things have gone from there. So I think when I reflect on my now 35 years, because this is my 35th year anniversary this year, of working in this field, I've been very fortunate to be front row for a field that has become a field during the time I've been in it. I like to joke that I'm kind of the Forrest Gump of study abroad. I happened to be there when lots of things that became seminal events happened. So for instance, the Forum on Education Abroad is the professional association that holds the standards for our field, and I'm now on the board of it. But I went to the information session that they held 25 years ago to create the organization. So it's pretty amazing to consider going to an info session with a number of people like this and to now be on the board of a professional association that guides the field I get to work in. So that's been very exciting for me. So what I want to focus on today, this evening, is a little bit about my journey. As was discussed, I worked for Regent's College. I then worked on-site in Ireland. I lived in the UK for 4 years with my husband, who then got a job in the UK, and I worked for a British university, helping them set up a study abroad program. I came back to the US and worked for a consortium of Australian universities, helping them recruit students. And then I eventually made my way to the University of Minnesota. So that's a lot of different perspectives. And while in Minnesota, I got the privilege of teaching students abroad. So one of the things, again, through this journey, and when I reflect on it now, and consider what we need to do to move it forward, I think it's really critical to understand where we came from, understand the past. These biases in the mythology around international education, particularly study abroad, and what we've sort of said were the things that made it better or worse and some of the judgments we've made about it, to interrogate who has participated and who has not, and consider higher education today and the role and the potential of education abroad in that landscape, and finally embrace the opportunity. I love to open on presentations with this photo. I don't know if people have seen this photo before. Some of you are nodding. It's quite a famous photo. This was not staged. This is an American study abroad student from Sweetbriar who was helping her friend who was taking a photography or doing a photography exercise, and the one student asked the other to walk down the street and got this photo. You can't see it carefully, but all of the gentlemen on the street are in fact looking at her. This is really interesting because if we're going to look at why study abroad is the way it is, we have to go back to how it started. Now, as many of you know, especially if you watch TV shows, there's now a trend to look at sort of the 18th century and the Gilded Age in the US, and when there was suddenly a lot of wealth. New wealth happening. Henry James has a lot of fun with new wealth and it going to Europe. So the interesting thing is, one of the markers of wealthy young people for men was to go to Europe and do a grand tour. Young men would go and travel around, sow some wild oats, get some high culture, do all of those things, and it was part of that finishing process that was really a marker of wealth and consumption for that era. Of course, we couldn't let women do that, right? We had to send them in groups with a chaperone. So, the basis of study abroad in the United States is, in fact, groups of women from women's colleges going to experience high culture in a way that can be trusted. So it's really interesting, even when we looked at the gendered dimensions of study abroad still, that women participate at a higher rate. It's interesting to go back to the roots being grounded in a mentality that sort of said, if we're going to allow women to travel, here's how we should do that. Which I'm not necessarily, and this will be a theme throughout, I'm not necessarily being critical, because there are risks and dangers that are inherent and gendered that we do need to acknowledge as part of this. But it's interesting to go back to some of the assumptions we make about study abroad and where those roots come from. So let's take a quick look at how we are on campuses. Now, I want to also qualify this that I'm going to be, as I'm going through this, discussing things in ways that might be provocative or ask questions. And again, this is coming from a departure point of we are still a field that is mired in a lot of notions of how things have been and how they should be done. And I also want to really call out that Ben St. John's is so interesting in this space because this is in your DNA in a really unique way. Hopefully you know this, but this is an institution that has punched way above its weight for a very, very long time in this. The history is incredible, and these two institutions are consistently ranked among the top baccalaureate institutions in the nation for study abroad participation. Recently ranked in the last Open Doors 14th nationally for baccalaureate schools, and mid-length ranked. Again, your commitment to semester-long programs is incredible. Currently, the rate of students who graduate with experience abroad is 48.7%. And so I think it's just really incredible, a shout out that your commitment is really unique in this space. The rest of us are jealous of it. As was mentioned, I was at the University of Minnesota for 21 years, and when I started there, the percentage of students from the university who had an experience abroad was 8, okay? In fact, I like to proudly say that when I started at Minnesota, we were numbered 11th in the Big Ten. Yep, you gotta work at that. And so the interesting thing was that we went from 8% to the time I left the institution, because the institution did commit to it. Going into the pandemic, it was 38%, and that happened in the course of about 15 years. So it's interesting. But again, this is something, to a degree, you all don't take for granted, but it's been part of the institutional commitment and landscape for a really uniquely long time. So I'm just going to quickly go through some of the things that are noteworthy as this has evolved as a thing. So where we are on campuses, and yes, that's me at Trinity College in 1990, rocking my Argyle sweater. So where we are on campuses has been an interesting evolution. Most study abroad programs had their roots in language departments for obvious reasons. That's who was going abroad. back in the 60s, 70s. And then we had Peace Corps returnees. The Peace Corps is a really important, influential dimension to study abroad for a variety of reasons. But we had this group of young people who are going abroad, getting funded to do their master's and PhDs and coming back to campuses. So it's a very unique influx of perspective. And expatriates. I often joke that when I started in the field, the person who was in charge of study abroad was a language professor, an ex-Peace Corps person, or someone with an accent who randomly got assigned because they had an accent. And I'm not kidding, Joe backed me up on that one. It's really true. So it was this interesting thing of like, well, I don't know, there's a British guy, let's have him be in charge of study abroad. So over time, we had the rise of international education. And again, I am in the generation which was the first full-time practitioners. I have friends and colleagues, this is all we've done, but we would be the first generation where that was even a thing. Then we started to move in the 90s to central offices and specialization of roles. By that I mean a person in charge of health and safety, a person in charge of short-term programs, some of those things that went from 1 or 2, 3-person offices to more specializations and growth in the field in general. Around that same time, we start getting program providers being a dimension in what we're doing. And as was discussed, I work for a very large program provider nowadays. We do nothing but deliver programs for partners, but that becomes part of what is the landscape of how students are going abroad, again, early 2000s. Now, also around that same time, academic degrees in research in intercultural theory and international education become a thing. This is really important because previous to that date, we had no way to prove the anecdotal. There was literally no data to prove the outcomes of what we did. So even if we knew something was happening to students, there was no research to support it. And people like Kevin were involved in, this generation of people who have come in and asked questions, assessed things, and helped us get better at the work through actual research and study in learning outcomes and things like that. Around that time, we have the creation of the Senior International Officer, which is campuses organizing international things under one umbrella. So it used to be international admissions as in admissions, study abroad might be in academic affairs, but we start having campus internationalization as a deal. And by the way, I'm going through 35 years of history pretty fast, but these are some of the markers that are worth noting. We get into curriculum integration and decentralization, certainly at large public institutions like Minnesota. Previous to, again, those when we were sending 800 a year, they were all from the College of Liberal Arts. Literally, there was no one from the business school going abroad, let alone engineering or other parts. And so we moved from saying this is only for one kind of degree student to what would it look like to have students from all degrees going, which now seems like a little bit like duh. But at the time, this was not happening at all. And this is, again, 2000. So that's how recent these things are. COVID in the virtual world, of course, education abroad, like many other things, comes to a screeching halt, but in a unique way. And I think we've wanted to move on from that, but it still underpins a lot of our, particularly infrastructure in lots of parts of the world that literally has still never come back. But also we move to the virtual world and we start playing with different pedagogical methods and ways to do things. And nowadays, we are very much so in this changing higher ed landscape. And I think it's, again, it's really important to say right now our relationship with higher education has changed, and in some ways it has not. And we've come closer to the center of higher education, which is great. We used to be very much so on the periphery. And I like to think that at many institutions, again, you guys were ahead of the curve, but it is no longer this thing off to the side. But that does mean that we need to look at it a little bit differently because now we are something that has to be part of how higher education is managed. And those of you who are here who work in higher education know that we are in a time in, I think, unprecedented change in terms of the acceleration of leadership in universities, the funding models, the attachment, how government works with higher education. All of these things are in a really interesting place right now. And I'm landing at the end on enrollment management because I think that's where some of what I'll talk about in terms of opportunity really being important to consider. So the next slide goes a little bit through various models and curriculum, again, from a historical perspective. And I apologize. I didn't get rid of that one side thing that says Maggie's Travel that I got rid of on all the other slides when I got the template, but there it is. I don't know who Maggie is, but God bless her and her travel. So the models, historically, the oldest ones are exchanges, a reciprocal notion of trading students one for one, or based in a very much so a departmental having relationships with another degree abroad, often again in the language. The historical thinking was that immersion was always better and longer was always better. And that was an underlying assumption that underpinned much of education abroad for a very long time, and honestly, in some quarters, still underpins it. I think center-based was a thing to varying degrees in varying places, but we used to call them island programs, which is obviously a pejorative term because it suggests that the students are not interacting with local culture, which is something we're going to start to interrogate as we go along. So short-term and instructor-led programs only come in the late 1990s. And as my colleague Sarah Spencer, who wrote one of NAFSA's first book on it, it's the democratization of education abroad, to be honest. We still have people who sort of say that's not as good as going for longer, but this is the moment when access becomes a real thing in honest ways. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. We start to get into experiential and internships even more, particularly within frameworks of academic pedagogy happening around that time. And then in the early 2000s, I can proudly say Minnesota did a grant, literally called Curriculum Integration, a FIPSE grant and a MacArthur grant, that said, what if we actually tracked ways for engineering students to go abroad, which had not been done before? It now is relatively interesting, common practice and an industry-wide term, but that was that intentionality to say, maybe study abroad shouldn't be time off, maybe we should be always tracking where and how and what is the best time in a student's academic degree to go abroad. So myth busting and outcomes research, again, around this time. So as I said before, until this time, most people in the field probably did feel like longer was better and immersive was better. So there were some studies that came out, again, the University of Minnesota, Michael Page and some other people did some longitudinal the SAGE study, and lo and behold, the impact for students who went on short-term programs is the same. And I can tell you, being at the conference session, again, as Forrest Gump, where this was presented, people were angry, right? People were literally, you have just shaken the foundation of everything that they believed yielded better learning in study abroad. And the interesting thing is when we go back and tease out what that study actually said, is it said program design matters, right? Intentionality around the curriculum matters. Dropping students into a place without any context and hoping they figure it out maybe is not the best way to yield learning, which now is, again, kind of like duh. But until then, the pervasive belief was that it was, you were dumbing it down or making it easy if you were putting that in the center or having your own faculty be really involved in that teaching. So it's really interesting when we suddenly have a moment where the data and the research is showing we've kind of been asking the wrong question. The right question is program design, perhaps. You can do really great short-term programs and you can do pretty poor longer-term programs. So if we flip what we think yields learning and outcomes and we actually have the data to figure out what is better, and we're looking at using learning tools like the IDI or intercultural inventories and being intentional in what we're actually putting in it, we can actually track outcomes and say, this program design, doing it this way along the semester, starting here, doing this way 3 weeks in, doing this at the end, yields better learning. So this is a really important shift, and why I want to start with this question of myth busting, because again, people in our field know this to a degree, but most of the common people, even in higher education, still are not aware of some of these shifts that have changed our understanding of the work. So then we get into embedded models. So, again, this idea that maybe it's fine to go just for a week over study abroad, particularly if it's embedded in a class that happens all semester. When you go abroad for 3 weeks, which I taught many times, you have to get it all done in 3 weeks. You don't get to come back to campus and say, now that you're back for 2 weeks, what are you thinking about now? So again, intentionality in curriculum design is really the important thing here. And then we get into virtual modalities, hybrid, things that might be some connection with on-site, online, maybe some, again, time spent there. And now things like FYE. I end with FYE, which is first year experience, which again is something that you all do. But this is a really interesting, really growing area, which is saying, it used to be, and I'll get into this, that study abroad happened in the junior year. Junior year abroad was the paradigm that most people know about. But if we know that there are outcomes that students have, spikes in GPA, engagement with their campuses, why are we waiting to the junior year to do this? And we also get into things around enrollment management. But again, these assumptions around when are the best time to go start also being challenged in ways that they hadn't previously been so. So what have we learned along the way? Well, some of the things that we've learned through experiments at various institutions, and certainly things that I learned in my time at Minnesota, growth happens unevenly. Campuses are forever saying where they want students to go, and good luck. When you figure out how to make students go where you want them to go, I would love to talk to you. Because we all have programs that are fantastic that students don't choose, and we don't always really know why. But we also know that most of us had scholarships that were really well funded that no one signed up for. So when people say it's only about finance, that's actually not true, because the data doesn't support. You can have super cost-effective programs. I can't tell you why Minnesota had to cancel so many programs to Mexico, but we were never really successfully able to get students to go to Mexico. And that's a different conversation about the psychology around that, but it's also a reality when you're doing program design. So one of the things we found at Minnesota is that we were creating all the programs for low cost. And low cost is really important for some students and also not for others. So actually, when we were growing, we added quite a few niche programs that costed a lot more, and students chose them. Some students, if they want the right experience that relates to their degree, they want the right experience and their families are willing to invest in it, which is, again, don't take away the message that I'm saying cost doesn't matter. It matters a lot for some students, and it matters not at all. But at Minnesota, we were making everything inexpensive, and we were not offering students opportunities that were perhaps more aligned with what they wanted to be doing, that they were willing to invest in and pay for. Timing and degree, as I said, is something that what we really have learned is that, for instance, for many science majors, particularly in things like engineering, but also in business schools, the first 2 years of the curriculum is the same for everyone. So second semester sophomore is an amazing sweet spot where the 13 degrees in engineering at Minnesota all take the same classes for the first 2 years, so you can get a cohort of 25 students to go to the University of Limerick and take core science requirements in the second semester of the sophomore year in a really unique way that you can't do later. Motivations vary. Interest and career are really key. So at Minnesota, when we were doing curriculum integration, we originally did everything by major, but then we realized we had a problem. We started working with our Health Career Center, and students who identify as pre-med might be doing chem, might be doing bio. And actually at Minnesota, you can do biology degrees in 2 different colleges. And so the motivation wasn't their major, it was their career outcome. So one of our turning points was we created on our resources on our website a combined resource. We have these things called the major advising pages, where students can go to a website by major and find the classes or the programs that support that degree of study. We, for the first time, did one that was career-focused, and it was for pre-health science students, and it became the most clicked one of any of the suite, because the students who wanted to go abroad who were pre-med, that was the focus, not the fact that they were a biology major. So to understand the motivations of why students are going abroad is really critical. And then the need to address identities in marketing and programs. And I think, again, we were not making it clear about who we wanted to have participating. We were doing a lot of things in the marketing that were leading to like very independence looking, and a lot of students actually want to go with their friends. And when we got over making it all about exploring independence and maybe being okay to go with your friends, that was a shift, but again, one that was counter to the narrative that was going on. Certainly being more mindful of students of color in our advertising. Minnesota, University of Minnesota is an MSI, most people don't know this, an ANAPC. Anyone know what an ANAPC is? It's an Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander, which is also awkward that those are collapsed together, but that's the government's decision, not mine. But because of the large population of Vietnamese and Hmong American students at the University of Minnesota, it is designated as an ANAPC. So we spent quite a few years really engaging with Asian American student associations and the Hmong American Student Association and a lot of those groups on campus, and also making sure that some of the questions that they had were addressed in our materials. We had a parent pamphlet that we we translated into Somali, Hmong, and Spanish, and it became the most used, taken away pamphlet at Parent Days. So, you know, to get this notion of if we really want to be inclusive, are we messaging it the right way? Are we addressing the questions that those populations have? And even as simple as other institutions, our participation rates with male students was lower. And one of our male student workers in our marketing department said, "Why don't we have any photos of food?" And we were like, huh? So we started putting in photos of steaks and food and things, and then we tested it with the students, and it turns out that was really compelling to a lot of the male students. And I do not mean to make those a judgment. This is a true story. And I can tell you, I was going through one of our catalogs doing a final edit, and I'm driving up north with my husband, and I look at him, and I say, "Does that look good to you?" And it's a photo of a steak, and he goes, "Ooh, awesome, where is that?" It was in Argentina, where they do have very good steaks. But it is interesting if we take the step back and say, you know, who isn't being engaged by our photos? Who isn't seeing themselves in our materials? And we have to think about it differently. It leads to some really interesting choices. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about the history, and I've talked a little bit about, you know, where we are and in this moment. And so now we're going to do a little bit of, you know, let's get critical in the sense of critical thinking skills. Let's give some more thought and interrogate where we're going, because it's always worthwhile to circle back to the question of why. And as I said, that's kind of my point of departure. Also to be able to say on a national level, the reality is that growth in study abroad and study abroad as a national project has arguably failed. The percentage of undergraduate students, if you include community colleges, that participate in study abroad annually, anyone want to give a guess? 1%. The percentage of students at baccalaureate institutions, so four-year baccalaureate institutions, 16%. The percentage of students who enter university or college expressing an intent or interest to study abroad, 76%. So, arguably, we failed. Now, we're not done. Nowhere near done. But as someone who has spent 35 years trying to convince students to go abroad to varying degrees of failure, I think higher education and our field has to look at where we've missed it, because we clearly kind of have. And I think it's interesting because, again, if we're getting into the biases, and that's why we're going to talk about some of them, some of our own choices in the space probably have led to some of these statistics. So we're going to talk a little bit about, again, the why, the where, and the how. So we're going to start with why students choose to go abroad. And we have some students in the room. So I would love to hear some of you say, any of you, why might be some reasons that students choose to go abroad? Yes?
It can be like getting more involved in like community or learning new cultures.
Great. Thank you. Okay. I'm going to do a list of my speculation, and again, I'm doing this from a historical perspective. So all my slides are kind of what I would have said 20 years ago and where I think we're going. So to gain culture, I think, again, when we go back to that notion of who went in the early days, it was this notion of language, culture, and there's still an element of understanding a culture, or the cross-cultural perspective certainly is still part of it. Acquire language proficiency, which none of you brought up, and it's interesting because it's not a thing, but it's not the driver of it in the same way it was historically. And when we get back to teasing out some of these things that people have been resistant to, again, as someone who runs study abroad programs around the world, I still work with institutions and know very good institutions that won't let students go to Spain and not take Spanish. And I think on one level you say, well, of course they should take Spanish. But also, these same institutions have a 4-year degree program from engineers that literally allows no space for language. Literally, it would add time. Is that the students' fault that they can't take Spanish and stay on track? So this is where we get into these things that are really in opposition to each other. And so an engineering student who wants to go abroad and stay on track cannot go to Spain, even if we can find them a semester at a wonderful engineering institution where the coursework is taught in English, which we can. Okay, to study arts and humanities, again, that really strong base in those areas of study like art history, like art, things like that. Again, a big part of the history. Also, we know that those are many of the areas that are diminishing on college campuses and struggling. To study social sciences, again. Now, this one I like to call out because while it's an important and a core part of who goes and study abroad, A lot of the history of the study abroad in this has still been in this anthropological explorer mentality, which as we get into a post-colonial mindset can be really problematic. It's interesting sometimes that there are still people who want students to go abroad and sort of really rough it and live in a place where they don't have many resources, which is really problematic to say we are seeking out a place that probably wish they had resources, wish they had Wi-Fi and water, and to seek that out in a unique way. Not that you can't, but you should be interrogating that with students. It's not the real. If I had $1 for every thing I've seen for a study abroad program that says real is almost pre-urban. So I think it's this mindset of what the real is every time I see the word real, I bristle a little because it often comes with this loaded notion of a nostalgia for exploring places that have been untouched, which is, again, problematic. Social justice and altruism, and as I keep saying, these are great things. I love the notion that people want to be engaged with communities. And again, it's one we have to be really careful of, that we are making sure that we are aligned with what the communities need, understanding of the things that we bring into that community. At the University of Minnesota, we worked closely with the health career centers, and we became very aware of the power of an undergrad showing up in a white coat, right? Because again, in other parts of the world, undergraduates are actually medical students. None of our undergraduates are medical students. And so we get into this notion of people wanting to go and help people, particularly in health things, and they don't have skills. We get students who want to go abroad and do things they're not allowed to do here, right? So at Minnesota, one of our basic tenets was if you can't do it here, you don't get to do it there. But I think these are things that people get in a mindset of, I want to go and help, and they don't have resources and they don't have that. So it's fine if I just go and take someone's, use a stethoscope that I might or not be very well trained in using. Personal growth. And personal growth is actually a really great one. But I think sometimes it's diminished or like not celebrated, as we are in a generation of people who growth is a really important part of why they're going to university, increasingly so, independence gains. So again, this is one that students identify, great to support. To become a global citizen, and I intentionally use that term, it's a really contested term in our field. It really caught fire, I don't know, early 2000s, is that about right, Kevin? Like everything was about becoming a global citizen, except it wasn't defined in any particular way, and the globe is not a geopolitical thing, so you can't be a citizen of it. And it kind of jumps to this, like I went to one place, I critically thought about it, so now I'm a global citizen. But that was a really buzzy thing that was going on for a while. And I think one of the things we found at Minnesota was that we often are asking students to become multicultural when they're in a space where bicultural is really where they are, and bicultural is a fantastic space for someone who's going abroad for the first time. To not be jumping to what does this mean in a global context, but what does it mean to just really be considering the difference between Irish culture and American culture. So I think, to take that dial back and not be jumping to this lofty outcome and make it something that is manageable in 3 weeks is really important. Checklist item, and again, not being critical. Students are coming in saying, these are the things I want to do. It is on that checklist. FOMO, fun, thank you for saying that. I think sometimes people in study abroad almost want to beat the fun out of study abroad. And study abroad should be fun. There's nothing wrong with that. There should be joy in it. There should be exploration. There should be moments of like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm here. That should be part of what we're doing. And sometimes we over-intellectualize it so much that we aren't leaning into the fact that this should be a joyful, wonderful experience, along with challenging intellectual, along with those intercultural pieces. All of that, it's fine to want to go and have fun. And finally, the career impact. And I'm using soft skills, and I will circle back to this at the end, but I feel like much of the career impact discussion has focused on this very problematic term of soft skills, because that's almost like they're not real skills. Again, career people are moving into professional skills and other ways to position that. But I do feel like that's something that has emerged increasingly as a goal, why students might be going abroad to be developing those skills. So why for institutions? So for each of these areas, I'm looking at it both from the student perspective and from an institutional perspective to the best of my ability. Again, when we look at why institutions were doing this, associating with culture, wanting their students to have those experiences from a very pure perspective, providing language proficiency, again, a huge part of the history, to enhance study of arts and humanities, part of the history, enhance social sciences, part of the history. Mission aligned, and this is really important, particularly at an institution like this one. I suspect some version of global engagement has been in your mission for as long as you have had working mission statements. And it's really important for institutions to, it's really sad when you see institutions where it isn't in the mission. That's really problematic if you are a practitioner. So hopefully there isn't a mission alignment from an institutional perspective that also is driving what that looks like, not just sending them abroad. We had, again, in the early 2000s, the race for the numbers. And at one point, we did get the University of Minnesota to #1 in the United States, although there's only one way to go after that, right? But everyone was obsessed with the numbers. And we took a step back and sort of said, wait a minute, let's discuss what is the right way, what are the goals, all of those things. But I think, this mission alignment is really critical in this space to be competitive. This is something that the best universities are doing, and it is U.S. News and World Reports now has an actual ranking for this area of it, and it is something that people are looking at when they're looking at institutions and rankings. To retain faculty, and this is often not talked enough about. You all are great in this space. This is a great faculty engagement tool. It's fun to teach students abroad. Faculty like the opportunities to perhaps do research and align with things that they're doing abroad. So as a faculty engagement and a retention tool, it's a wonderful thing to do. Although I will add that that is more meaningful usually in liberal arts colleges or liberal arts colleges on a campus. Interestingly, at the University of Minnesota, it's very hard to get any of the engineering faculty to go abroad because they are incredibly well paid and they can go and do research anytime, very well funded. This is really interesting. They are not, a free trip somewhere is 0 carat. So it's really interesting what actually is a tool. You can't assume it is a tool for everyone because it turns out. And Kevin was at Carlson School of Management. What people get paid to teach in a business school is really different than what we pay liberal arts instructors to go abroad. So there are just some very mechanical challenges with some of those pieces that should be part of it, but play out very differently. Increasing expectation, again, this relates to being competitive. Many students today are looking at colleges. I'm sure you work with your admissions office a ton because this is one of the reasons why students are looking at this institution. They know they're going to go abroad, so they want to know what are the opportunities, where do you have programs. Was that part of the factor why you guys chose to come here yourselves? Yeah, and so I think to acknowledge that is really important. Okay, Nessie. Any of you who are familiar with George Q's research, the National Student Survey of Student Engagement, thank you. When he did this research in the early 2000s, this was really important. It identified the 5 high impact experiences that really accelerate retention and success for students, and lo and behold, study abroad was on the list. And it's really interesting because at Minnesota, when that came out, that was our watershed moment where the university had engagement challenges, and suddenly we were a potential solution, which relates to the next one, which is enrollment management and solutions. So when I was at the University of Minnesota's biggest challenge was 4-year graduation rates. At that time, any of you who know it, in the early 2000s, it had very poor 4-year graduation rates. I'm from Minnesota, and in the 90s, you didn't choose to go there because you knew you were never going to get housing on campus and it would take you 6 years to graduate. And it's interesting how much the university turned that around during the time I was there. But the interesting thing is that when they were looking at Nessie and the challenges with 4-year graduation rates was about the time I started with the office. And the question came up, did study abroad add time? So the interesting thing is the pervasive belief was that it probably added time, probably especially added time for students in things like the sciences. And so we went to institutional research and asked them to run the data because we actually didn't know. It was quite possible that it did, but if it did, we needed to know how badly, we needed to know what the impact was, it only in certain areas. And lo and behold, I'll never forget it, John Kellogg, the director of institutional research, called me and said, "Are you sitting down? You're not going to believe this. but in every single demographic we've run the numbers in, students who go abroad graduate in a more timely fashion than those who don't, at 4 years, 5 years, and 6 years. And in every single college, and, because we knew what people would say, he put in ARC scores, which are their composite of their GPA and their test scores, how they came in. So every band of, it wasn't just the highest achieving, most successful students. We ran every demographic, and we still can't say that there's causation, but there's correlation. And the interesting thing for us was we were suddenly a potential solution to the university's biggest problem. So talk about a way to start asking for resources, because we still don't know why, but we actually know we are a potential solution to the university's biggest challenge. And so I think one of the things when I talk to institutions about, this enrollment management, and a lot of what I do with my organization now is working with a College of Science and Engineering at an institution and say, what are your bottleneck classes? Computer sciences right now, people can't find enough spaces for their computer science students because everyone wants to take coding. So could we create a coding class for you in the summer that your students could take that would fulfill that requirement and alleviate your pain on campus? So a lot of our first year experience programs, the University of Massachusetts Amherst had a metric around melt for spring beds. They know how many students they're going to have transfer out, and they have empty beds on campus. So they very quickly said, what if we sent 100 abroad every fall and then put them into those beds? We can over-enroll the freshman class by 100 students because we're going to send 100 out. Yeah, it's genius. So suddenly, we are a solution to a myriad of institutional challenges in a very unique way. And that's when, to me, you can tell I light up. This is when it gets fun. If I can actually figure out a way to help institutions, my own institution, that was really exciting for us when we suddenly we were moved to the center. And a lot of Minnesota's success had to be with leadership at the university who understood and acknowledged and really worked with us on how to be a solution. And of course, then there's revenue. That's a fair, in today's landscape, that's a fair reason for institutions to need to do things, but it also means sometimes it changes how study abroad is done. As revenue became more of a conversation, we see people moving into models such as homeschool tuition, so students are paying the same as on campus, and then perhaps the university is looking for programs that are less than on campus, but they're letting students take their aid. There are a lot of different ways that institutions do this, but instead of saying, I don't want students to go abroad because we'll lose tuition, that's when you need to get creative and figure out a model that works for both, because that is possible. And then finally, again, institutions are leaning into the career, and we'll end on that piece, but it is certainly increasingly part of why institutions. Any comments from those two sections for students or institutions? We'll have time at the end for questions, but before I go on, also clarification or anything like that. Okay, where for students? Again, language acquisition being the older one, the social sciences and the explorer, which we've discussed about. But then we start moving to an era where English language speaking world is really critical because students are studying things, again, that don't have the room for language, or they can't stay on track with their major. They really need specific classes, and so we start looking for that in the English speaking world. Beaches, just gonna say this, as someone who worked for a consortium of Australian universities in the 90s, beaches were a thing. And the interesting thing is this is still a time when this is growing where people are going places because it's time off. This was a real challenge for my organization because students were saying, I can't bring any of it back anyway, so I don't really care, but I want to go to Australia, which is really tricky. Our partners in Australia certainly did not like that. Those are fantastic institutions that happen to be in Australia, right? And so, but this is a thing, and as it's evolving, I like to throw in again the unexplainable or the romantic. And I say that because no one in our field can account for why Prague became a thing. And I say that as a Czech American. My dad would be like, why are you picking on Prague? But the interesting thing is no one teaches Czech language. None of us know how or why Prague became a juggernaut in study abroad in the late 90s. The students found out it before we did. Barcelona. No one can account for, Barcelona is lovely, but no one can come up with a real logical reason why students all want to go to Barcelona. Florence is interesting because Florence has that positioning in the grand tour, where even parents are often more willing to let their students go to Florence than other places, because Florence has this romantic notion that we've all had embedded in our brains through film and things like that. And so parents will often say, oh, Florence, that makes sense. That's pretty cool. But some of the others, and I love this about our field, sometimes we have no idea how the students all decided to go somewhere, right? You're like nodding. It's a thing. And it's also kind of beautiful. I think the romantics, sometimes we don't spend enough time thinking about, there's students who are like, I've always wanted to go to Paris. I don't know why. I think that's kind of nice. There are worse reasons to go to Paris. Paris is a lovely place. And so sometimes we lean so much into the career and the curriculum integration that we aren't just like, sometimes students just want to go somewhere, or they read a book that struck a chord with them. So when I was a kid, I read these books. I don't know if anyone read these. Betsy Tacy Tibb books, Marred Heart Lovelace. Some of you are nodding. She's from Minnesota. And I reread them in my 30s, and my gosh, it was super embarrassing because Betsy in the Great World, where her parents actually sent her abroad in like right before World War I, and it turns out most of the places I went backpacking were where Betsy had gone. And I had completely forgotten, but somewhere along the way, because I had read a story of a young woman going to Venice, I was like, I want to go to Venice. So I think, again, it's easy to be dismissive, but these are some of the things that are going on with students. Where they're allowed and where faculty are going. Again, this is a really important part of us also saying, I like this professor is going this place. Okay, I really like that professor. I trust where they're going. This is where my institution has a program. These are dynamics. Not everyone will adhere to them, but plenty of them will say, I do trust that my institution has developed a good program and I'm going to go there. Cultural influence. So I love the Olympic effect, okay? My favorite is the Lord of the Rings. During the 5 years that those films were out, New Zealand grew 300% year over year for 5 years, which is awesome. As someone who does cultural studies, I love trying to figure out what is the next one that's going to happen. Because again, Olympics, we always get a spike. There are cultural things that suddenly just introduce people to cultures that suddenly make them excited to go somewhere. And it's really interesting to follow the tale of the study abroad from that. Where they need us, and this relates to some of the social justice, this idea of people have a notion of where they are needed more than other places, and that can be a driver. Again, problematic, but also is a real thing. Curriculum driven, thank you for bringing that up. It can be things I need to study or things I can't study, and I love that you said that, because actually when we did a data analysis of health students at Minnesota, the biggest thing many of the health students were doing was going and taking Spanish, which the College of Biological Sciences doesn't have space for, but they know they need Spanish probably for their career, and they can't take it at Minnesota. So it's that crazy, there are reasons that sometimes are shadow reasons to what we think would be obvious. The career outcome driven, where their community is going. And I think this is a trend that, again, is controversial in our field. We work with places where entire fraternities all go together. And the gut reaction of many practitioners is like, ugh. And also, if that's the only way students are going to go, okay. And I've leaned into, again, I work in study centers, I'm the provost, I control the curriculum. I actually sometimes don't care why they're there or if they know why they're there, because I believe in the process. I believe in the curriculum. I believe in the magic of our faculty. So I think one of the things that sometimes we get so stuck on is whether or not they had the right reason to go. And if we keep having that be the barrier, we're just going to miss a lot of them. And I think it's also interesting having taught, and those of you in the room who have taught, when I taught my class in Ireland, it was during the time that Carlson had a requirement for students to go abroad. So let's be honest, 75% of my class was students from Carlson who just wanted to go to Ireland. And I would say to them at the orientation, I will pretend that you didn't sign up for this class just because you want to go to Ireland if you pretend to care about Irish film and drama for the next 3 weeks. And they'd be like, oh, you know that's why we're choosing Ireland? But also, some of the most magical papers I have read in my career were from those students. And one of my favorite things about study abroad is it is random. I defy you on day one to say who is going to transform the most. And some of you are nodding. And sometimes that person who, like, first day you're like, whoa, I don't know how this is going to go, is the one who has something magical inside of them that you get to be the person to help foster and tap. So I think sometimes we're very judgmental about things like groups all going together, but we need to maybe consider that again, if that's how that student needed to go, and if that's the courage and the bump they needed, is that necessarily so bad? And then finally, safe, which is a really tough word, but right now we do have a generation where, certainly from their parents' perspective, where is safe is increasingly a question, at least that we are getting a lot. And it's not always logical, because the crime rates in Barcelona are, frankly, pretty much so the highest anywhere. And I've had parents, I had a long call with a parent who wouldn't let his son go to South Africa, but would allow him to go to Barcelona. And statistically speaking, that's not accurate. But this is one of the dimensions that is part of our work nowadays. So for institutions, where personal institutional connections, again, historical, where the institution has faculty to faculty things, a lot of the roots of historical exchange programs are from that. The language needs, what language departments are at an institution drive these things. Exchange partners, again, these longstanding relationships, and I know that a lot of your programs historically had that very unique relationship with the partners that you had longstanding institutional relationships with. And that's a great driver for how to do it. Real estate is an interesting one. This is the ribbon cutting at Syracuse University's new facility in Florence. It's a really, really big, very nice building. But real estate is a driver. Many of you may know that St. Cloud State has a castle in northern England, and it has been a challenge. I often joke at Minnesota, I was very fortunate that I never inherited a castle or a chateau in the middle of nowhere, because it becomes this thing that is driving where they're trying to get everyone to go. And that can be a challenge. Students don't necessarily want to go to those places. And so I think, but real estate is an unsung dimension in a lot of decision-making around study abroad at plenty of institutions. Back to that mission-driven. You know, when it's done well, this is the university saying what sorts of experience and locations align with our goals. And then partnership programs, again, things that are hopefully even have a dimension of reciprocity to them. International campuses, this became a huge thing again in the early 2000s. There are plenty of institutions that open campuses around the world for local students and some of their study abroad students there. And there was for a while, I feel like it's still there, but a little less, the buzziness of having multiple campuses around the world suddenly became a thing, and everyone wanted to have a campus abroad. And it's interesting because at my organization, we manage programs for partners. So plenty of our partners will say they have their own program somewhere. It is their curriculum, but they are not hiring. They don't have the facilities, you know. But the notion of having something that you have as a signature program and have that curricular oversight of certainly is very attractive to institutions. And it allows them to have their signature or the buy-in from faculty, buy-in from departments. Those are really good things, in my opinion. Underrepresented. Right now, there's a really big push for right now the dominance in Europe is even greater than it was before the pandemic, and that's been a point of concern. Now, again, as I said before, the pandemic decimated lots and lots of infrastructure, and a lot of institutions did not help the partners that they had relied on, and they went out of business. And that's a reality that our field doesn't like to talk about, but is a reality of the field. And I think also in the underrepresented space, I saw this at Minnesota, where we ran a lot of programs all over the world very, very successfully. We were always very proud of that. But sometimes I say to institutions who say we want to send students to more students to Africa, I will say, that's fantastic. Tell me why. And they actually kind of don't know why, other than they feel like they should be. And the interesting thing is, Africa right now is the entrepreneurial, hub of the world. Like, I can give you 5 reasons why you should send students to Africa. So there's no right or wrong reason, but you should have a reason as an institution, other than just we feel bad about what is in our portfolio because we feel like we should have that, but we don't actually know why. So I think that why is so critical before we get to where. Back to that mission-driven, back to the sorts of experiences, the outcomes from the students. And then where program providers, as I said, my organization, because of the financial realities of campuses, less and less places can be operating on their own. That's where they are partnering with people who can create that infrastructure, deal with the health and safety. I mean, the reality is a lot of people, students were stranded around the world with partner institutions that didn't have the wherewithal with the pandemic or the infrastructure to get students home. So the risk and liability dimensions are a bigger deal than they've ever been. So there are lots of reasons why institutions are having to really rethink how they're doing these things. And again, I'm not saying anything is good or bad, just laying the landscape of where the conversations are right now. So that leads to the final section, I'm gonna go back. Hope you guys didn't read any of those answers. How do you wanna study abroad? You don't okay, we'll jump to this and then you're gonna tell me after if it makes sense. Independently. So this is still some students, but back when I studied abroad, almost no one went with other people. And that's, again, not good or bad, probably why not a ton of people went. But it was also almost privileged that you should be going by yourself. That like was really the thing to do. And it's really interesting because if you are Gen X, which I am, you know, God forbid anyone would tell you where to go. You wanted choices and you wanted to choose your own thing. Some of you are smiling and laughing. It's really interesting. The psychology was we had to have loads of choices because students wanted to all choose something different, and they all were kind of, it's ironic that we didn't consider ourselves snowflakes, but we certainly were in that landscape that we wanted to be doing something that was just ours. Homestay was the dominant way, particularly language learning, of how students studied abroad. Integration, being at a local institution, again, was the dominant academic delivery mode. Then we start getting into faculty directed, again, with that growth in the early 2000s. We started to see growth in community engagement, students really wanting those experiences that were, again, this desire to integrate with the community that wasn't just necessarily at a local institution, but through internships or community service things like that. Study center, always there to a degree, but starting to grow greatly late 2000s. And part of that, again, has to do with the curricular pieces. So for instance, my organization has a study center in Sydney, Australia. One of the challenges for some students is that the Australian calendar is flipped. Some of you know this. So the sequencing is the opposite, and the dates for the terms are wildly different. So there are students who want to study abroad in Sydney and want to study engineering, and they want to go on the same dates as their semester, and they need to stay in sequence. And so a study center is the only way that they're going to be able to do this. And so there are, again, pedagogical and appropriate reasons why people want US grading systems. They want feedback throughout. They don't want a situation where you have a blue book test, which is your only assessment, which is still a deal at plenty of institutions abroad. We just see a shift in the expectations around the delivery, that more and more students, families, institutions want experiences that are closer to an American experience. Now, that doesn't mean that our faculty are primarily local faculty. So you have faculty who are bringing it in. And of course, when you do that, you can be saying, for instance, we have every syllabus on our planet has an element of difference. So they must be bringing in a guest speaker that's bringing in a different cultural perspective. Even my favorite example is if we are teaching accounting and you have a guest lecturer who owns a firm, can you find someone who's an immigrant who owns an accounting firm and can talk about their experience having an accounting firm as an immigrant in that local community? These things can be done. Again, it's back to, if you control the curriculum, you can get really creative in these places. So you're not saying we're replicating the same class we do in the US, we're just gonna teach that abroad. I resist that notion, but there is something that you can do that does that, but also brings in local case studies, national European perspectives, all of those things. But the growth in US pedagogy and coursework certainly is a trend. Professional skill building, and I say professional skill building because this is when we're getting into actual concrete professional skill building, which maybe happened in a lot of places, but not everywhere. And so really leaning into what are the skill sets students want and need for their professional futures, and then multiple times, which of course, especially if we're sending students as a freshman, the probability that they want to go again, and I'm sure you guys see plenty of repeat offenders who want those comparative experiences, and I think it used to be people thought you were going to go once and that was going to be it, but that is less and less the case. How for institutions? Again, going back to that history of preferred partners, without loss of revenue is often how institutions would prefer to be. To populate particular centers and locations where they have agreements or have infrastructure. Mission, community engagement being a big part of how for an institution. To gain control revenue, again, just a reality of the finances of how this has to work. Curriculum alignment being huge. It is, in most cases, institutions don't want students taking time off, adding time to their degree programs, so curriculum alignment is huge. Enhancing things on campus. There should be that ebb and flow where that experience doesn't just exist abroad, but is brought back to campus. Things like this are a great example of ways that there increasingly should be that ebb and flow, where it isn't this thing you did out there that isn't informing what you're doing here. I love pipeline programs where, for instance, honor students go abroad, do some research, and then it informs their senior thesis. Beautiful. When things like that can happen, it really brings it full circle for the experience. And again, that enrollment management of more institutions looking at how this can be part of their overall plan for how they are managing degree programs and campuses and things like that. So, getting near the end here, international experiences as a career. I'm going to end with really leaning into this because, again, I do think this is one of the areas that we just haven't leaned into enough. And there's so much data that has not been yet codified, but is starting to be. So the Forum on Education Abroad is doing a Career Catalyst initiative. It's very, very exciting. Go to the QR code. There are quite a few elements to this research, but it is the first very serious national attempt to get a lot of data around career impact for education abroad. At Minnesota, we did a career readiness, a career integration initiative, and we did a study, 800 students going out for 30 years, did respond to a survey, and two of the biggest takeaways for us were that more than 50% believed that their experience abroad had been critical to them getting their first job, but more importantly, 80% felt that they had proceeded in their career faster than their peers because of their experience abroad. And it's interesting, this study, I'm not going to be critical because it's a great metric, looked at first jobs. And I think this question of long-term impact is really important because when we went back and interviewed some of those students, they said, yeah, when an opportunity came up to go abroad, I was the first person they tapped because they knew I'd studied abroad. These are things that that makes sense. They were better in multicultural groups in their organizations because they had intercultural skills. There were all sorts of gains that accelerated their careers, and again, self-report in their opinion. But this is a really important story. So the forum worked with 4 R1 business schools and did data analysis of their students. This is just last year. Their students, their graduates, because business schools all track employability, of course. And they did a difference between those who had studied abroad, and the average across these 4 massive business schools was a almost $4,200 difference in salary the first year. That's the first job. So in some ways, at some institutions, if you did a short-term program, literally you paid for it in your first year in your first job. So these are the kind of metrics that, again, this is an interesting story that we need to lean into. It also relates back to the point of who's been able to go abroad, because I don't think that we've leaned into the career piece as an access issue enough. And again, I give credit to the leadership at Carlson School of Management because when they decided to require study abroad, everyone said not everyone can afford to study abroad. And the leadership said, then we need to find the money. Because if we do feel like students who go abroad have an advantage, then it becomes an access issue. It literally becomes, if we all know this is something that does make a difference in careers, then why aren't we making sure everyone has access to do it? And I think that's a really important framing shift rather than it's a nice thing if you can afford to do it. And then the students who are already relatively privileged are the ones who are getting the benefit in their career impact. So we need to really think about that dynamic going forward. So what is my point? I do have a point, or a few of them. First of all, just that nostalgia for the past that excluded so many may not serve us well. And again, I understand that I'm good at change. I like a little bit of chaos, and I'm a pretty pragmatic person. I understand that for some people, they really believe that the way they did it, and this is common to all of us as human beings, that the way we did it was the best way because it was wonderful for us. And, so I love my experience at Ireland, and I had amazing professors at Trinity College. I can also now look at it and say that I was in Ireland during the Troubles, and not a single part of my academic experience discussed the Troubles, right? Because I was at an Irish institution with and Irish students didn't want to talk about the Troubles, right? So I had to go back and read the newspaper about the Troubles. And I got back and people said, wow, and buses exploded while I was in Dublin. But this is one of the challenges, is when we assume immersion creates these things, we need to think a little bit more about that. And so the good old days of study abroad, a lot of things happened to people and they didn't have any health and safety backups. A lot. Women in the room are nodding. A lot of things happened that were not great. So I think this nostalgia for the good old days, we have to be pretty careful. A lot of great things happened, and also there were things that were problematic about those paradigms of how we were doing it. Most importantly, the participation and the privilege for who was going abroad is just problematic. Understanding who created our mythology and history is critical to move us forward. Again, really thinking about why. When we think this is the best way to study abroad, take that step back. And why do I think that? Where does that come from? Where does that notion come from? Acknowledging why we've not achieved the growth that leads to the necessary questions. Like I said, we need to keep going back and saying, who are we missing? Why is the message not resonating? And how do we change the message if that is the case? The field has evolved and moved from the periphery to the center. So this, to me, is the most exciting part. We are no longer off to the side. We are increasingly critical and a solution at our institutions. And that is such an exciting moment if you've spent a career on mine where it's been a big fight to get to this location. So let's take advantage of that. Enrollment management, growth, career impact are not diametrically opposed to quality and meaningful learning. I just, at our forum conference, someone said, I just wish they would just go abroad for the sake of going abroad. And I don't think that that has to be diametrically opposed to career outcomes. We can have quality intercultural experiences and career outcomes. So I think we keep pitting things as if it's a zero-sum game, and it's not. They both can be true. So how do we figure out ways to make all of these things be true? And how do we lean into the benefits for all and excellence in program design? As I said, we know so much now about what yields the best learning, as we do on campuses, but even more so abroad. There are dimensions to it. Those of you who have taught, again, you can have a conversation with students on site about things you could never have a conversation about here. They are in that liminal space. They are suddenly seeing things. They're decentered. They're with a group of students in a very intense way, and magical things can happen. So it's on us to make sure that the curriculum, the location, the choices, where, when, and how does its best to foster that. And I will now open it for questions.
Thank you very much. This was an amazing presentation.
Thank you very much.
As I was listening, watching, I was just really struck by all the complexity that is involved in this. And even though I'm someone who's taken students abroad and sort of in a couple different places, things like that, I'm still sort of struck by the sheer complexity. And I think our Center for Global Education must be the smartest division on campus for everything you guys are managing. I found myself trying to think of what's the right formula for this? And then but then I thought that maybe isn't the right way to sort of look at it. With all of this complexity, it made me think about how study abroad is a productive experimental space. And so I was wondering, what's the balance, do you think, is there a balance? What's the balance between relying on methods you are tried and true for you versus creating room for experimental space in study abroad when it comes to designing programs? And along with that, where do you see sort of directions to lean for some of that experimentation that's happening right now? We have our study abroad folks here and faculty here who are also thinking about what kinds of programs would we want to work with them on devising in the future. Thank you.
That's a great question, and I appreciate your nod to the complexity. As you know, I have a PhD in theater, and I often think study abroad is like staging a great play. You know, if the buses show up on time, no one notices that there were buses. It's like going to a play, you only notice the blocking in the direction if there's a tree in your way. If it just is a great play and you're immersed in the experience, you don't even realize decisions went into it. And I think that's one of the challenges for our field. We make it look far too easy. It's sort of like going to a restaurant and being like, well, I could have bought those ingredients and made it at home. No, you couldn't have. You wouldn't have known how to put it together. There is so much art and design and science to what we do, but art is a big part of it. And I think I'm a big fan of the pilot. I love organizations or departments or people who come and sort of say, have you ever tried this? No, but that's really interesting. And let's try it and call it a pilot and assess it and see if it does our entire field, so many of these models that I talked about were the first people saying, what if that's not true? What if this would work? And what would that look like if we were going to do that? And I think partnering with our academic departments is a critical part of that. I think that, at Minnesota, I worked for about 10 years with our College of Science and Engineering when we were just starting to send any of those students abroad. And my husband's degree is mechanical engineering, so I was a bit advantaged because I speak a little bit of engineering. And the interesting thing was that when we first met with them and talked about what we had, they were like, our students don't love journaling. And again, a cornerstone of pretty much every study abroad program at the time was journaling. They said they like to do things with their hands, and that doesn't mean they're not thinking. They process information really differently. What if we did something that asked them to do a final project that was closer to a design project based on community needs, but they're not journaling about it, they're doing a solution-based thing because that's how engineers think? Magic. I would never have thought of that. So I think one of the things when in my experience, when we do our work the best, it is leaning into the incredible expertise you have with people who know a lot about study abroad pedagogy and mixing that with people who know their curricular areas in a way I don't. When we can come together as equals and say, tell me what your goals are for students who are doing a chemistry degree. What are your goals and what might that look like in good study abroad programming? That's when it's really interesting. And I think, again, this assessment piece to figure out if we know there are programs that are effective, what is the methodology to figure out why? So at Minnesota, one of the things we had for a while, we were doing IDI, the Intercultural Inventory, pre and post for all the short-term programs that were going abroad. And then we had this really interesting thing that there were 3 or 4 that every year were just more successful, and that's one metric and sometimes controversial, but that were more. And so one of my colleagues did a really great for her PhD. She went back and tried to figure out why. And the interesting thing is that it turned out that the instructors of those programs were particularly interculturally savvy themselves. And so the interesting thing is that the better the instructor was at fostering an intercultural conversation that happened happenstance over dinner, this thing that happened to me in the street today, I don't understand, can you help me make meaning of it? The more they had an ability to foster that conversation, the greater the spike for the whole group, which is interesting because then the short answer is if we do more training with our faculty, then potentially we can be ramping that up across all the programs. So I think the cool thing is either what's going on or what is a problem and how do we get creative about it? And I love that word because it is about creativity and a little bit of risk.
Do you see the next 5 years, because of the political situation here in this country, the rest of the world views us, we Americans, differently? And do you think that's going to affect your study abroad?
So great question. History would tell us no. I was abroad during Bush 1 and during the weapons of mass destruction, and it was a really hard time for students to go abroad. We've had plenty of times when it's been tough for students to go abroad. It's interesting because people will say the world is less safe now than it was. But I could tell you, going back to Lockerbie and Arab Spring and Paris attacks, our field has weathered so much, and memories are kind of short. It's kind of wild. 9/11. I mean, there are things that people said that it won't ever come back. So it's really interesting. I think one of the dynamics is that students often want to leave the country during times that are tough in the country. Like, that's a thing. A lot of students are kind of like, I would like to escape all of this and go abroad for a while. It is hard to go abroad during times of, when we're going to get questions. And again, I brought students to Ireland, and I brought some of them after Trump was voted in the first time. And I said to them all, this is Ireland, you will be asked. It's not a if, it's when, because the Irish love political conversations. And it's interesting, people are dismissive of the English-speaking world, but you can't hide behind a language barrier, right? So you are going to be asked. And I'd say to them, you can say, I'd rather not talk about it. You might have voted for Trump. You might not have. You can be ready for that, but don't think it's not going to happen. And this is going to be a great opportunity. So just in your mind, be ready for what you're going to say. So I think we can also get better. In my organization, we do a lot of how we foster those conversations, how we prepare students for questions that they're going to get. But I think it's really interesting. I don't know, if you all would say the same, but every time we think, oh, it's not going to, work. I think one of the things that I really like also about the career piece of leaning into it is that it is something that is non-polarizing. Right now, we work with a lot of schools in the South, and they're struggling with sending their students abroad in a lot of their contexts, but everyone agrees with skill development and career outcomes. So it's really interesting because it is a non-polarizing argument for why students should continue to go abroad. Workforce development is a big conversation everywhere, and so then that becomes an opportunity.
Thank you so much, Martha. And I have an analogy and then a question. So my analogy, when I was a student here, we had a required art experience as part of our curriculum. And we had to go to, I think, 6 performing arts events and 2 visual arts events or something, and track that we went. And since I was a music major and also a usher in fine arts programming, I got those knocked out in the first semester, right? But there were people who didn't until right before they graduated, and they were sitting in the back of the Great Hall for the concert or something to try to check this off. And the belief at the time was that requiring participation in the arts as an audience member is going to help you in your life. It's going to help you in your career. You won't go to a orchestra concert with your client and not know that you don't clap between movements or something. And I loved it because I got to be part of that experience as well. My question for you is, and I should say, now that I work here, I know that it's not the same as it was when I was a student, and for very good reasons. We don't have exactly that same type of requirement, but we have different ones. I'm just curious, in your research and in your experience, what is the benefit to requiring an experience abroad? I know you mentioned Carlson School of Management, and you also mentioned the assumptions that have to be true for us to make sure that it's a quality experience abroad. And what is your recommendation for whether institutions might consider requiring this type of experience? Thank you.
Thank you. It's such a great question. So when Carlson and the faculty voted to require it, actually, it wasn't even administratively driven. And in fact, the leadership of the study abroad office came running down to my office, and we were all like, what? How? All of the things. And we were very conflicted. There was an exception process. I should qualify it that way. But there was this I don't know if I think all of them should go abroad. Definitely. I had that bias too. And I think, it was really interesting as we did the matrix of how a few of the things that rise to mind pertinent to your question is that I think it was really enlightened that Carlson said right away, it doesn't have to be in business. Anything that is one of the legitimate, and in fact, Mike Houston, the wonderful associate dean there, wonderful man, he came and said, I'd love them to take your class in Ireland. I think that's great. And if they have an interest in art, and that's what the thing that they need to fulfill with this, wonderful. His goal was exposure. His goal was, we're in Minnesota. University of Minnesota, 70% of the students are from the state of Minnesota. We're a flyover state. You have to work to get somewhere other than Canada, and I love Canada. I hate when people dismiss Canada. But, so it was an exposure goal. And I think, again, that's a really great mission goal. They knew what the goal was. It was exposure. And a belief that exposure starts somewhere, and even every time I taught, I had at least one student who'd never been on an airplane. Every time I taught, including to Australia, God bless her. So, you know, I think it's if the goal is a relatively simple one that has that true, and then I believe in the process. And I love your analogy about the art. I think I do love that. Again, I took the students to the theater, and I always did a talk about going to the theater and that we're going to get a little bit dressed up because I don't like when Americans go in their jeans and tennis shoes to the theater. You know, so we did that, and I had students who'd never been to the theater. And I had a wonderful student, John, who pulled me aside after class and said, I don't have any dress pants. Would you take me shopping? And I took him, I get choked up. I took him to the H&M in Dublin, and we bought him some black dress pants. And he wrote to me a few years ago and said, I'm now in a corporate thing, you know, take him out to dinner. I still remember one student from Wisconsin said, what is a cheese goujon with a raspberry compote? Because we had the choices for this first course. And I thought, okay, Martha, I can do this. And I said, a fancy mozzarella stick with raspberry jam. And he's like, I'm getting it. And he loved it. You know, but again, how do we help? And I love that, you know, if the assumption is these are business students who are going to be in the world, who are going to have to be in these places, better they do it for their first time with me, you know, and with a group of students and in something that's exciting. And if that helps, I'd have students write to me after and say, you know, I took my girlfriend to the Guthrie to see a play, and I did that thing where I ordered a drink at the interval before the show, and she was really impressed, you know. So like these life lessons, we all can remember the people who were kind to us and who did those things for us. And I think this is, if the goal is to do a few of those things and they learn a little bit about Joyce along the way, like that's super cool. So I think it's back to that, what is the mission, what is the goal, and not making it so lofty. You know, sometimes the magical things we want to happen in 3 weeks aren't realistic. So sometimes it's really just being realistic, and then other magical things do happen. Students didn't have any questions. What's up with that?